Okay, let's talk about Jesus.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Death by Adaptation podcast, a bi-weekly book club where we choose one classic book and compare and contrast it against its cinematic adaptations. I'm your host, Nicolò Grasso, and I'm joined, as always, by the great Ewan Gleadow. How are you doing, Ewan?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm actually really looking forward to this one. I mean, I look forward to every episode. I say that every episode, I imagine. Either that or something about what I've eaten.
True.
Today I've had 2 bowls of cereal, 2 bowls of coffee, 2 cups of coffee, and 2 bowls of coffee. I just poured it on top of the cereal,
Nice.
and I had an egg. Delightful.
Well, it sounds very light. Sounds like you're fasting, some might say, because guess what? It's April. April this year is where Easter happens. It's happening. I don't remember. Is it high season, low season? I don't know how that works, but it's happening in April, and so this is our April Easter special for the Death by Adaptation podcast. And this kid was very spur of the moment a couple months ago, where I was kind of like, we should do an Easter special.
Yeah. What are we on about with high season, low season? It's spring. That's the season.
Yeah, no, because here they say like, when does Easter fall? And it's like, oh, it falls low this season. I was like, wait, low in the sense that it's like in March. It's like early March, because sometimes it's in early March.
Happy Easter.
Yeah, that keeps changing. I don't remember the specifics of why it keeps changing every year, but it's something to do with like the scriptures or whatever. I don't know.
Oh, right, okay. It wasn't in the book.
It wasn't in the book.
The book we read, not the holy book.
In the book, they don't go like, and here's how Easter is going to work before I die.
That's just a quick roundup.
If you've listened to last week's episode, or if you've read the title of this podcast, we're talking about the last temptation of Christ and Passion of the Christ. And I mean, if you're listening to this on YouTube, if you're listening to this on Apple and Spotify, because I've seen the stats, most of you are on Apple and Spotify, consider subscribing, following us, leaving a like, leaving 5 stars, helps us out a lot. Share it with your buddies. It's a good time. It's a good time to get some reading done, watch some quality movies. Oh, depending on taste, I guess. But, let's start by talking about the last temptation of Christ.
I wish there was another way. I'm sorry, but there isn't. I have to die on the cross.
I won't let you die.
You have no choice, neither do I. Remember, we're bringing God and man together. They'll never be together unless I die. I'm the sacrifice. Without you, there can be no redemption. Forget everything else. Understand that.
No, I can't. Get somebody stronger.
You promised me. Remember, you once told me that if I moved one step from revolution, you'd kill me. Remember?
Yes.
I've strayed, haven't I? Yes. Then you must keep your promise. You have to kill me.
That's what God wants. Let God do it. I won't.
He will do it. Through you. The temple guards will be looking for me where there aren't any crowds. We'll go to Gethsemane. You'll make sure that they find me there.
No.
I am going to die. But after 3 days, I'll come back in victory. You can't leave me. You have to give me strength.
If you were me, could you betray your master?
No. That's why God gave me the easier job. To be crucified.
And The Last Temptation of Christ is originally a book released in 1957 by Nikos Kazantzakis. Probably butchered the name, apologies. But he was a Greek philosopher, writer, essayist, very religious, very devout man who struggled a lot with faith throughout his life. And so he came to a point where he was almost like 56 years old, where he decided to write The Last Temptation of Christ. He wanted to take the figure of Jesus of Nazareth and taking everything that's found in the various scriptures and the various gospels and telling a more human rendition of this story, a more human tale of Christ, because that's something that often gets lost. When you go to church, you go to mass, it's kind of like yeah, Jesus spoke really well. He's very eloquent man, very eloquent lad. He was always very clever, knew what he wanted out of life, and he was the son of God and all of that. But you never fully get the idea that he was a man. He's a very transcendental figure. And so Kazantzakis decided to make him flawed, make him filled with doubt, filled with questions, with lingering thoughts on his faith, on his meaning, what he's supposed to do in life. And he wrote this book, The Last Temptation of Christ. So, Ewan, what are your thoughts on this novel? Very long novel.
Very long.
So long.
Not as long as 50 Shades of Grey, which says a lot about our culture.
True.
No, it's very, very good. And I'm sure we'll get into lots of the gruesome details about the controversies and the impact that this book had. And it does have an impact. Martin Scorsese doesn't direct anything these days, but the actual novel itself from Kazantzakis, not a clue.
Kazantzakis.
I've butchered the name, you've butchered the name, we'll move on. Nikos, that's what we'll call him. First name basis with the lad. No, I think it's a very powerful novel. And I was thinking as I read it, it reminded me a lot of Silence, not because of the infliction of religion, but because of what we spoke about last time when we did Silence. And it was it was more or less the same. It was a very moving piece. It was a very interesting read. It was very, I can understand some of the criticisms and the calls of blasphemy on it, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yes.
It's a lot to unpack, and I messaged you just before we started. I've made genuine notes this time, no joke, lot of notes made.
I'm proud of you.
For the first time. Put my wrist through, battered hell. I have to write down my thoughts. But no, it's a very, well, like you said, it's a lengthy book, but it's also a heavy one as well. Not in the literal sense because I read a PDF, but like as an emotionally heavy book. It holds a lot of weight historically. And I think those are always the ones that are interesting to discuss, the ones that have something quite large to them. Because, this book was condemned by the Catholic Church. I think it was condemned by the Greek Orthodox Church.
Yes.
And I'm sure we'll get into it as to the reasons they did and whether or not we think that's right and stuff like that. But no, as a whole overall gesture, very, very interesting read. No, how do you find this?
I loved it. It took me a long time to read it. Like I started reading it back in February. So I'll get cracking on this book, read it and enjoy every page. But it took a while. But I finally finished reading it, and it's great. And it is an interesting companion piece to Silence, not only because again of the Scorsese connection as well, but just the way both stories manage to be religious tales that I think, in my opinion, they get under your skin, they go deeper underneath the surface of just what religion can be and how many people live religion. Because we've criticized a lot of bigots and other nice fellas when we talked about Silence, but there's a lot of hypocrisy, especially when it comes to reading the Gospels and taking various messages and ideas from the Bible and from Jesus's life and these speeches and these parables. It ends up feeling a bit wishy-washy. It's kind of like, turn the other cheek and just get on with your life. And even other stories that try to, well, even speaking of movies, I've watched, for instance, like the Gospel According to St. Matthew's by Pasolini, I think. I know Rossellini made another movie about him. So there's a lot of biblical stories, but it's always very, very, it's always very clean. It's very clean.
Yeah.
It's very, Jesus is always like this calm, soft-spoken white man with a bushy beard. It's just, he speaks and everyone listens and he's so nice and he sacrifices himself. And I love that the first 200 pages of the novel, it's Jesus just suffering, being in absolute pain, where he keeps having these visions that are horrifying, of just angels and voices, and there's demons, and he's just tormented inside. And he treats his mother Mary like garbage, and she's frustrated because she's like, I don't know what to do with my son. It just doesn't feel like my son sometimes. And everyone hates Jesus because he's a cross maker, because he's of course son of a carpenter, and he's making crosses, and so all of his fellow all of his fellows, Nazarenes, Israelites, I guess, Jews, just hate him because of that. It's very like powerful, like you said. It's heavy, and it's just talking about it and thinking about it. It's like you're feeling it in your chest. Just the weight that this man is carrying, the burden of just doubt. Like, who am I? What am I doing on this earth? And so all of that leading to him going into the desert and just having this acceptance and revelation of, I am the son of God, and I'll try and be just, while still having a lot of doubts and still having these temptations of the like carnal temptations of the last. You have the character of Mary Magdalene that we'll talk about. It's it's a lot. It's a lot.
It is, yeah. And just before we move on a bit, it was what you said there about how heavy it is, and like, you know, what he's put on the earth to do. I don't know about you, but I think that a lot. It's like, I'm not comparing myself to Jesus. Let me just put that out there. We do have the same birthday, but that's not my point. Christmas
You
Day,
do actually, yes.
99. No, as in, like, I don't know what my purpose is. I have no idea. I've got a career I love. I have no idea if that's what I'm meant to be doing. And it's always that doubt that actually plays with my brain quite a lot.
Mhm.
It's I don't know why, because I'm quite comfortable where I'm at in my life, but it always worries me. And I always pick up the strangest influences on thinking about that. I read Johnny Cash's autobiography, and that calmed me quite a lot. I don't know how. It was about a man that did a lot of drugs and made some good songs. And also an album from a new band called Yada. There's a song on there called Tall Poppies. And it's about getting stuck in your hometown and just sort of dwindling your life away. And that terrifies me. And I think a lot of that sort of sprouted up when I read The Last Temptation of Christ, because it is a lot of suffering. And it didn't put anything into perspective. It just re-embellished the fact that I'm thinking about these things, which is nice, because it is nice to be reminded of stuff like this. It is nice to be reminded of suffering and what happened before. And it contextualizes a lot, despite it being essentially an adaptation of the Bible, which I thought we were reading. I don't know if you remember when I messaged you asking if we'd be reading the Bible for this episode, and I was like, well, I think I've got a copy somewhere.
The entire New Testament this time? I don't know.
Crack it out, 3 days, speed read it. I'll fit it in with reading Peter Hook's book on the Hacienda. Not a problem.
To be honest, it's probably a shorter read, just the New Testament and the Gospels. Just a shorter read than this book.
If you get the pocketbook one, definitely.
The children's abridged version of
I
the
used
Bible.
to have that.
We still have it somewhere, I guess.
Maybe we should have read that.
Man, just get cracking for next time. But yeah, it's. I agree with what you're saying. I'm full of doubts every day. Every day, try to, it's like fake it till you make it. Those sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Just if you think you're pulling it through and you're doing what you're doing, then everything's going to go well. But you're always feeling like those. You lie down to sleep, and those thoughts, they start coming out from the darkness. And you're reading the book, and then we'll get into the movie as well. But you're reading this book where you see Jesus is just lives an absolute hellish life, mistreated by everyone. He just wants to do his job, and he doesn't know what he's supposed to do. And that's when I go, oh, I get him now. Like, I can get behind this Jesus because he is human. And that's something that has always missed for me. When I was a young Catholic boy, going to church every Sunday and going to catechism, like Catholic school, all of those wonderful Sunday school, and all of those wonderful things, just memories. But it always feels like it's something unattainable, and you have people telling you like you have to suffer for this reason and that reason, and they feel that something is missing. And I tip my hat to Kazantzakis. Poor man died soon after writing this book, because he did like press tours, and he went to Japan or China, and he got like a shot of a vaccine shot of some sorts that just played with his immune system because he was very weak. And they told him, don't go there because you might die. And he was like, no, but I'll do it for the press and for the people and the book. He came back and died. and they didn't want him to be buried in a church and have a proper like mass and all of that. So poor man, poor man. He went out not with a bang, but with a whimper, and it's a shame. And
It is, yeah.
yeah, let's just get into the controversy because that's going to
Yeah.
transition into
I was just
the
going to say
film.
before we jump to that, I didn't
Yeah,
realize how many books he'd written. He
so many.
wrote Zobra the Greek, which I didn't know.
Yeah,
Um,
that could be another Death by Adaptation.
yeah, he wrote so much, and I think it's one of those authors that kind of they're very prolific, and then they're just sort of forgotten about. But when
Yeah.
you chance upon their work, it's like, oh wow, this is very very strong. But yeah, very controversial.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. Like speaking of the controversies, I'll just be straight. They're crap. They're
yeah,
just
it's
um, it's a very close-minded way of looking at the novel. It feels like people. Well, that's actually what it was. A lot of people didn't read the book. They were kind of like, "Oh, you're what?
yeah.
Jesus is horny for Mary Magdalene now? Get out of here! Burn the book!" Just it's like, no, no, no. But it's good actually. That's works about it. That's what works about it is that fact that he's like feeling tempted by those things in a very earnest way in terms of the Mary Magdalene character, who here she's made up to be a childhood friend of Jesus, just not in the scriptures. But it's an interesting way to add depth to her character because they were friends and she wanted to be with him, but he was very weird. And so she ended up becoming a hooker because she couldn't fulfill the joy of just being physically with Jesus. But ultimately, when he becomes enlightened, she finds that joy just by following him around, which is very beautiful and poignant, I think. Um, but you get all of these controversies where they're very surface level, and it is, I think, primarily the problem is that people don't want Jesus to be human, and I think that is something that we see and we've seen throughout the centuries and even nowadays, because for me Jesus is a symbol, and like many symbols people don't want to see flaws in them, because if you start seeing flaws and if you start like they just collapse. And I've had a long conversation. I don't think if we ever talked about it on the podcast, but I had a long conversation with a friend a few years ago about Greta Thunberg. She hates Greta Thunberg for a lot of reasons, but I was like, you know what? But she's a symbol. Like she's not supposed to be a scientist who tells people what to do and how to do that. And that's not what she's doing. But she's there to be a symbol. But she's too human, and she has flaws, and she's this and she's that. And so you take someone like Jesus, who's one of the most popular, if not the most popular, historical and historical, kind of fictional figure of all time, and you make him human. That just destroys everything. Because you go to church, you hear the priest telling you like he was pure, he never did anything wrong. He got upset like once in a temple because they were doing some shady deals inside of it and just bartering and other things. So he got upset once, but that's the only real emotion that he had outside of love. It was all about love. He was always very clear about what he wanted to do. And if you say, well, but what if like he was a man? He probably went one day thinking like, hey, am I really the Messiah? How can I be
Yeah,
100% sure?
yeah.
You say that, you just boom, massive
That's the thing.
ridge.
I think the best, emblems or icons, they do have flaws because people can and will learn from flaws. They learn from negative experiences just as much as positive experiences.
Yeah.
And I don't think it should be controversial to sort of compartmentalize Jesus and the disciples and Mary Magdalene into teachable lessons and new portrayals of parables or messages. I don't think there's anything controversial about that. Personally, I can see why someone might take issue with it because the image of Christ to them is very sacred. But it surely must be more sacred to have a flawed image because you can learn from that. Not everybody is perfect and nobody can be perfect, but that's, I suppose, Christianity. It's to try and live life as a perfect individual like Christ was.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know. I think it's, especially in this adaptation, I think seeing the flaws of Jesus, seeing him called a blasphemer, seeing him struggle with feelings that aren't represented anywhere in the Bible, I think it's an interesting angle, not just because it adds depth to these people, but also it adds flaws to them. It adds to them. It gives them that humanity that you were talking about. It makes it relatable. It makes it interesting. It makes it something that people can take more than one message away. You know, like the Last Supper. There's I mean, the briefest of moments with that, and it has layers to it. It has more to offer, not because it's done anything different, but because it's a writer just adapting it. And I think a lot of it, I think controversial wise, there's no way of saying that right, is there?
I think
Controversially wise,
sounds about right.
in reference to the controversy that Nikos has caused, I can see it being an issue if people are seeing this as him compartmentalizing his own faith and dealing with his own doubts, because he was a man that was very spiritual and very religious, but he also had his doubts. If this is his way of sort of exercising his own demons, I mean, fair enough. That's understandable, and he's written a very, very great novel.
Yeah.
I can see why people would take offense to it, in the way that it's a man toying with his own personal faith and doing it in a very public way. I don't think there's any issue with that. I think personally, if that has helped him, then that is what Christ probably would have wanted. But who am I to say what he wants? I don't know. We just have to say we're both 25th of December through and through. Me and Big JC. But I think the issue that people are always going to have with it is that Christ must be a perfect figure. That's not the case, and we'll get into that with the film adaptations as well, because you cannot adapt the life of Christ if you're going to portray him as this perfect entity. Max von Sydow tried that kind of, and from what I've heard, didn't go well. The thing I wrote down is that the more controversial an adaptation of a parable or story from the Bible, the likelihood of it is it's better than the ones that are just accepted. You know, nobody talks about Pay It Forward, that Kevin Spacey film from the late 1990s, and looking at your face, I can tell you've seen it as well. I watched it in religious educations when I was like 14, and it was dreadful. It was always that, Bend It Like Beckham and Bruce Almighty. That was the trilogy.
Bend It Like Beckham as well.
Bend It Like Beckham, yeah. Because if you believe, you can do anything you want.
I guess, sure.
I think actually that was more about different faiths. We were learning about different faiths in that lesson. I don't really remember, because to be honest, as soon as someone said we're watching Bend It Like Beckham, all pretext of learning leaves.
I've seen it the one time, so it's been a while.
Yeah, one time's more than enough. And I think we watched about a quarter of The Prince of Egypt, which I haven't seen since.
Oh, that's a good one. It's great.
It is, yeah.
Great musical as well.
But that's the thing. It's, you know, you think of, I don't know if you had them in Italy, like on the run up to Christmas early morning, if you were watching TV early enough, there'd be like really shit adaptations of The Birth of Jesus, like horribly animated 80s productions that are just horribly cast and look really cheap and poor. But because they're faithful adaptations that don't, you know, you're not going to show The Last Temptation of Christ on Christmas Eve at 8 o'clock. You know, you're going to show something like...
You should.
You should, yeah. It's a classic.
If I had control of the television.
But I think it's because the implication that someone would project their own thoughts onto something that is very much, not a public figure, but something that the public looks up to and finds comfort in, to project negativity onto that kind of rattles them a bit. It rattles their cage, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I think it's always good to challenge yourself and your perceptions and even your faith. It's like, I have no idea where I stand with the religion. I've got a rocky road with that. 18 years in a Catholic school hasn't done me much good. But it's the little bits of influence and the little things like reading this that kind of, at the very least, this offers a pause for thought. The films can't do that because you're very much active and engaged with it. You can't keep pausing that to think about what Scorsese means, which we'll get into, because I think Scorsese's adaptation, beautiful. But the actual book itself, you can put that down and think, well, what does this reflect on me? What can I learn from that? And I think that's really beautiful. And I think that's why, to bring it up again, that Johnny Cash autobiography, he spoke about his faith and sort of the poetry of the written word is that it can have so many meanings to it, but it can project something so clear when just before reading it wasn't. And I felt that a lot with Johnny Cash's autobiography because of how open it is, how honest he was. And I do feel a bit the same with The Last Temptation of Christ, where he's written with such clarity of his own beliefs and the lack of faith at times. And it is quite touching. It's very, very, it's not reserved. It's really going for it. And it's passionate. And I think that's the most important thing for stuff like this, is if you're going to adapt something this grand, you'd best believe in your passions and your beliefs, because that is the only thing that's going to steer you through the controversy that inevitably meets your project.
Yeah. Well put. Well put. It's art. Art has to be personal in order to connect with more people.
Yeah.
He made something very personal, and it paid off. And it paid off with another man as well, Martin Scorsese. Martin Scorsese, who received the book when he was younger, I think in the 70s or something, and he decided to make it as an adaptation. No one wanted to finance it, which is a running theme with Scorsese's religious movies. But finally, it got financing. I think the studio was with Universal. Universal decided, like, okay, we'll finance your weird Jesus movie, but then you're going to make another commercial movie for us, which ended up being Cape Fear in 1991. But here we are, 1988. The Last Temptation of Christ, starring Willem Dafoe, Harvey Keitel, and Barbara Hershey, among other people that we'll get to.
I was going to say, you've missed out a very surprising cast member there.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Oh, yes, we'll get there. I think you know who I mean.
I do. And it's this movie, just like the book, massive controversies. If anything, bigger ones. This movie premiered at the Venice Film Festival. Lots of controversies inside and outside of the theater, with crowds trying to boycott it because, again, they only heard about the infamy of the novel. No one actually read it. Reading is hard. Watching a movie is easier, and so they found it to be dangerous, which I don't get. How watching this movie could be dangerous, especially considering that the entire story is ultimately Jesus being tempted in the end, shown that, hey, just, you don't have to be crucified. You can just leave and you can enjoy life. And Jesus does, and he's like, "Well, cool. I'm married to two women. I'm with Mary Magdalene. Then she dies. Then I'm with two women, and they have a ton of children, just enjoying life. But ultimately, this is not me. This is not my role, and I can see behind the veil of lies that this demon, faking themselves as an angel, has created. And he ultimately accepts his role, and he decides to stay on the cross. And it is done. It has happened." Just dies. It's a beautiful, poignant ending, but people still thought it was horrible. Just damn it. But thankfully, like, we're in the year 2022, most of us have seen the light. Most of us know that The Last Temptation of Christ by Scorsese slaps hard. Ewan, how hard does it slap?
It do be slapping. Let me tell you, Nick. It do be do. No, it's fantastic. I remember watching this for the first time way back, literally, last year. Like, the day this podcast goes out, it will be a year from then. The first time I watched it, and I was blown away by, again, the personal side of it with Scorsese. I think for me, it's Raging Bull got him back on track after he had his own demons to deal with drugs and stuff like that. I don't know enough about it to go into it, but I know the importance of Raging Bull was that it did get him back on track. And it feels like The Last Temptation of Christ is essentially not him making peace with himself, but certainly a step in that direction. Certainly a step towards rekindling a faith, or at the very least looking into himself a little bit more. And it shows every now and then little splitters of it. It's a beautiful piece of film, not just because of the performances, which I'm sure we'll get into. Willem Dafoe is, wow, just phenomenal. And Harvey Keitel, just unbelievable. It's one of those performances where words don't do it justice. That is a performance like no other. And Harvey Keitel's got a fair few of those. You think Reservoir Dogs, Bad Lieutenant, The Piano. The man was on fire in the 80s and 90s. He would not stop. But from a technical perspective, the framing, the actual positioning of the camera, how Martin Scorsese frames Jesus, how he frames Judas, how he shades them and shadows them, it's really remarkable. It's such a touching piece, and it's also a very faithful adaptation of the novel, which I think is overlooked a bit, considering how bigger film it is for Scorsese. It's a very personal adaptation, but it's also an adaptation of a very personal novel. The key theme naturally is going to be these people are struggling with their faith and have rectified it by making something about it. But I didn't think there'd be that much in common between the two, even though it's the same text. But there is. It's the redemption of an artist, and I think that can be very touching. And it is very touching in these two instances.
Absolutely. It's such a, you said it best. It's just beautiful, just plain beautiful. There's so many sequences in this film where it is actually fairly. The only real difference is that it's more restrained in some
Yeah.
of the more, let's say, fantastical aspects of the novel. Because when Jesus is having those, like, he's constantly tortured by these visions in the book that are very apocalyptic even sometimes. It's haunting. It's like flying over the world and seeing various images. Like, you read it and you go, how can you actually make it into film? And the answer is, in 1988 you don't. You just make it a bit more, again, more personal, more stripped down, and it works. When Defoe's Jesus is in the desert, and he like sees the snake talking to him with Mary's voice, and you see the flame and Judas's voice, like, oh, it's very simple but so beautifully done. I'm surprised you haven't mentioned Peter Gabriel's score.
Oh, how can you not? The man that made Sledgehammer did this as well. Fantastic.
Just a man of many talents. It's brilliant. It's honestly a terrific score that puts you right into the setting. Which, again, actually, this was filmed in Morocco,
Yeah.
which is, again, grounds it into this plausible reality. Again, Morocco is not Israel, of course, but it captures what you might think Israel 2,000 years ago was like. And it's great. And I love that you mentioned Harvey Keitel, because I
Razzie
was,
nominated Harvey Keitel for this film.
no,
Worst supporting actor of 88 or 84.
we could
88.
say probably worst color of beard and hair, because he's a redhead. He's a ginger in this, but that's also in the book.
Which is
That's what
how
I
we
was-
know he's evil.
That's how you know he has no soul.
To be fair, apparently I've got ginger streaks in my hair at the moment because
Oh,
it's
no.
sunny, so it brings out ginger in my hair. Which is why I'm shaving it off. I'm going for the 80s Phil Collins look. Bald at the front, perm at the back.
Nice.
I'm not actually
no
doing
one
that.
can know your secret.
No one can know that I'm actually a secret ginger. When I grow a beard, it's ginger, and it's like
Oof.
I'm either going to grow it long enough to dye it, or I'm just never going to grow a beard. I think it's the latter.
You can go full Jakob Flash in a couple of years.
Jakob's got a great beard though. Like I
Jakob
could
does
never
have a
grow it
great
that
beard.
good.
I can barely grow anything. It's like after the temple gets destroyed, it won't be rebuilt in this case, unfortunately.
Oh
Um,
no.
But no, speaking of Judas, like, again, in the novel as well, he is a redhead. But this again connects the story to Silence, Scorsese's film, in the book,
Yes. Yeah.
because in that one you have a Judas-like character, and he is necessary for everything to happen, and that's also acknowledged in the book. And you're watching and reading Last Temptation of Christ, and the character of Judas is beautiful. In the Bible, in the four Gospels at least, he's always been portrayed as, just kind of there following Jesus around, kind of annoying sometimes, and ultimately he betrays him. I think in Gospel according to St. Matthew's, he kills himself as well, kind of as a change of heart. And he's like, what have I done? And just hangs himself, unfortunately. But you're watching this story, and Judas is hired by the Zealots early on to kill Jesus, because he's just, what's he doing? He's building crosses for the Romans, just kill him. We don't need him. He's a stain on our society. But Jesus is already like become enlightened at that point, and he just says, okay, well, I'm here, just kill me. I'm ready for it. And that puts Judas off. It's like, you're weird.
You're weird.
You're just weird, but the way you speak, the way you're saying things, is making me rethink my own life.
Yes.
And I want to be with you. And then whenever you watch freaking biblical adaptations, it's always Saint Peter, I'm going to build with you. You're the first stone that I'm going to build my church with. Things like that. He's always there. He's always a bit annoying. I don't like Peter, just a flawed character, annoying as hell. And you have Judas in this one, where Judas like has no error in his tongue. He's like speaks his truth. Is he defends Jesus? Is always there for him. It's a very complicated, dare I say, slightly homoerotic relationship that the two of them have. But it is very touching, and the fact that Jesus asks him to betray him is like, this has to happen, and you have to do it. I'm not strong enough to accept my own faith. I need your help, and just help me succeed as the Messiah. Help me die.
Yeah,
Oh, Harvey
I think
Keitel is brilliant. Just oof.
it's phenomenal, and I think it's not just the very obvious dynamism between the two of them. Defoe and Keitel have a chemistry like no other. They are two of the best working performers at the moment, living or dead. They are some of the all-time greats. Phenomenal actors. And obviously, a lot of it comes down to the chemistry between the two of them. But a lot of it as well is the subtle little things, the little tiny details, the let me whip out the A level in media studies here, ladies and gentlemen. The Levi Strauss's binary opposites, just the black and white connotations, what it means, and the eventual formulation of they're not actually at ends. They're not at odds with each other. They're not one side of the coin and the other. They're actually somewhere muddling around the middle with different ideas of how to go about their religion and their faith. And I think that adds such a nice layer to it, that is such a strong and powerful layer that isn't in the other film we'll be chatting about.
Yep.
But I can't not mention David Bowie as
Yes.
Pontius Pilate, because it's 88, so this means that it's
It's after The Hunger for sure, and before Twin Peaks.
After The Hunger, but from an album perspective, it's like he's a couple years after Labyrinth. He'd done Let's Dance a couple years before that. He's in his Thin White Duke phase, I'm pretty sure, or was that the Berlin period in the 80s? Anyway, he's in a bit of his he's not in his cocaine and bell peppers phase anymore, but he's just a bit after that. And it's so strange seeing him play such an important figure. Because, by all means, don't get me wrong, David Bowie was a fantastic performer. He was a great actor. The Man Who Fell to Earth is spectacular. I mean, even his cameo in Zoolander was very good. He knows how to play depending on the situation. And I think the situation he gets himself into in The Last Temptation of Christ is a surprisingly important and poignant performance. It's the supporting characters in this film, and you got to give a shout out to Harry Dean Stanton as well.
Yes,
phenomenal, incredibly important, not just to the fabric of the film and what it means to these characters, because naturally Pontius Pilate and Paul of Tarsus are very important to the retelling of this tale, but the actual performances themselves give so much more than you would first perceive. If you watch this film the first time through, David Bowie, Harry Dean Stanton, very cool. The second time watching it, it kind of dawns on you just how important they are to this story. They are, without a doubt, integral. Not just because of the characters they play, but what they offer. The little subtleties, the little illusions here, and the building blocks are in place for them, and they're essentially assembling them so Willem Dafoe and Harvey Keitel can have a big bust-up, which is lovely. They serve their purpose immaculately.
Yes, and it's a film that just moves so, like, the pacing is great for a movie that's almost 3 hours long.
Oh yeah.
It just it's great, and I love the final portion of it, the Last Temptation, the title of the movie, when he gets off the cross and then he just manages to live life like he wanted to, like a normal man. It's kind of like, maybe I'm not the Messiah. I'll go have sex with Mary Magdalene. It's just, this is cool. This works. I'm liking this. That's basically all he goes through. And again, fairly accurate to the book. I mean, one of the better changes is that the angel that's actually a demon disguises themselves as a little girl and not as a, quote, Negro boy.
Yeah.
The like, that's a bit, it is a 50s book, and we are in Middle East, so it's okay, I guess. But I'm thankful Scorsese didn't go that route.
Yeah, it's
Scorsese and Schrader, we never mentioned him. He co-wrote the script. And
he
yeah,
did, didn't he? Yeah,
Paul
it
Schrader,
was
man.
what a guy. What a. I mean, this is is this like his last big one until Bringing Out the Dead like 10 years later? He had that
Schrader or Scorsese?
Schrader, not Scorsese.
Ooh.
Scorsese never had a dip. He just wouldn't dare.
Oh well. Cape Fear.
Hey,
I'm not a Cape
whoa!
Fear guy.
Really? Cape Fear was one of the first Scorsese films I watched, so I've got a bit of a soft spot for it. But that's my mum's favourite film. I don't know why.
Oh, okay.
My mum's favourite's Cape Fear, and my dad's is Cats and Dogs too. So
What a combo.
what a combo! I once watched that film 3 times over the Christmas period. Cats and Dogs too, not Cape
Jesus.
Fear.
No, to be honest, like Paul Schrader, just as a small side note, he made Light Sleeper after this one with Willem
Yes, he
Dafoe.
did. Yeah.
Oh, it's so good actually. That's a good one. That's a very, very good one. If you're listening to this, if you haven't watched Light Sleeper 1992 with Dafoe, watch it. It's great. The father of the same composer as the Card Counter.
Oh,
Like he made the music to Light Sleeper, very similar.
it's certainly not the first time Schrader's written about faith either. So
No.
it does, although this doesn't feel very personal to him, he did have the opportunity to do that with First Reformed, which
Yeah.
I think is not an equal, but certainly a very strong representation of personal faith. I think Schrader does very well with that. I mean, I guess you could argue Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, is a bit, but not as much as First Reformed.
Yes.
Certainly
First
not
Reformed,
as much as The Last Temptation.
Even Bringing Out the Dead, it's fairly spiritual.
I do, yeah. It's a very, very strong film. It's probably my favourite Scorsese film.
It's close. I mean, I say
Phenomenal.
it's close. I have like 10 movies that are close. This one included. Just it's a stellar filmography, and I'm happy that this movie has been, it's been accepted for the near masterpiece that it is.
Yeah.
Just this blend of spiritual pain versus physical pain, exploring the struggle between a spiritual way of living and a physical way of living. There's so much in this that is beautiful, and ultimately what I think is especially powerful is that it's all about forgiveness.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's no real villain in this film.
No,
which
no,
is
not particularly, no.
well, because even then, like you mentioned Harry Dean Stanton, who plays Paulus, but Paulus, before being Paul or Paulus, he was Saul, and he was violent. He killed people. He was against the Romans, and he's the guy who ends up like going to Damascus, and he gets blinded, and then he just accepts faith. He's the only one who became kind of an apostle, and he wrote letters, and he went around spreading the word of Jesus without ever even knowing him properly, which is fascinating. And it's all these different characters that, even though they have villainous connotations, even someone like Pontius Pilate, who condemns Jesus in the end, it was above. Well, I mean, it wasn't that's okay. Pontius Pilate. It's kind of like, just not my problem. I'll just wash my hands of the blood. It's fine. So it's fine. Which even then there are darker things with him in the book. That's kind of like
Yes,
expanded in
yeah.
the latter portion, where he became mad because he kept like dreaming that he had blood on his hands and he couldn't wash it off. It gets very twisted in that sense. But
it's
again,
a lot
that's
more ruthless in the book than it is in the
yes.
film.
And that's the temptation. That's the temptation
Yeah.
for vengeance, for violence, for fixing the wrongs that were done against Jesus and his followers. Like all of that's found in the latter portion of the story.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's one of the great parts about the book as well, is that it's not just about the last temptation of Christ, it's about the last temptations of those that did him wrong, those that helped him, those that hurt him. And that's nowhere clearer than the literal blood on the hands of Pontius Pilate. It's such a compelling image, and it's just it's incredible. I mean, you've said everything I could have said about it there. It's such a rewarding piece to write and just to read and just to experience. There's such a strong sentimentality to it. It's the ability to make something so personal but so broad and so influential. It's fantastic. It's so great.
Yes. And I think we can move on to
Yeah, to something not so great.
something that's interesting, I'd say,
Yeah,
because
okay. Yeah.
Last Temptation of Christ is a very well, it's not based on the Bible. It's not what like people think of that. It's not. It's based on a fiction novel that's explicitly stated to be a fictional retelling of the life of Christ. Something that's actually sold as being very factually accurate according to the Gospels is Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. And I'm not going to play any clips for this because it's all in Aramaic, so it will just be some cute music from the movie, which is great, to be honest. Like, the music is great. But Passion of the Christ came out February 2004. And I don't remember that date specifically, but I remember when it came out because you could not avoid this movie. This was a phenomenon properly. And I was 7 years old, and I still remember, or 8 years old actually, and I remember everything that happened around it. People drove in masses, not just in the US, but in just Italy and other Catholic countries. They drove in masses to go watch this film. It became a proper blockbuster that no one could expect. It's kind of like, who's going to want to watch 2 hours of a Mel Gibson Jesus movie? Well, a lot of people did, and the selling point is that this is the Passion of the Christ. That is the actual the final 12 hours in Jesus' life, where he goes to Golgotha and then he gets captured, he gets tortured, cross of bear the cross, crown of thorns, just go to the Calvary and die. That's the film. That's the film. It's very clean. I'll just say this. I think Mel Gibson, and this might get me in a lot of trouble. I think Mel Gibson is a great filmmaker. I genuinely believe that. It's Braveheart, Axel Ridge, Apocalypto, and this one. I know he made another movie. I even watched it, like the Man with a Thousand Faces. What's the name? I don't remember. Doesn't matter. It's
He
all
made
right.
another movie.
He made it's the feature debut. What's the? I'll just look it up real quick.
Oh,
The Man Without a Face. Apologies. Which I want to say was written by J.J. Abrams. Am I?
excuse me.
No, it's not. It's not. That's another Mel Gibson movie. Nothing. Forever Young. That's Forever Young. I think it's written
Oh,
by J.J.
yes,
Abrams.
yeah.
But no, just the Passion of the Christ. Like I think Mel Gibson is incredibly talented and very skilled as a director. I even watched because at the time I watched the an hour and 40-minute making of documentary of this, sped up because it's just we had to do the recording. I was like, I can fit it in. I can watch it in time. And you can see like he works really well. And this is a bold film. We're talking about a 2 hour super R-rated, gory version of the death of Jesus, entirely spoken in Aramaic and Latin. Who was going to finance this? No one. That's why he self-financed it. And
It's
indeed, it's a gamble that paid off. It was the highest grossing R-rated movie before it. Up until it, chapter one, I think. Or until Deadpool maybe. But just it made so much money, and I would say there's a bit of hypocrisy around that, which is very frustrating because you get a lot of angry parents who don't want children to watch R-rated movies, don't go to the movie theaters to watch that violent crap, your Jigsaws, your Texas Chainsaw Massacres, and all that. But then it's like, oh, but if it's Jesus, it's all right. If it's Jesus getting maimed and brutally tortured, that's fine. We can watch that. That's culture. So yes, I personally, I'm excited to know what you think about Passion of the Christ before I go deeper into my thoughts.
yeah. So, I mean, like you, I think despite Mel Gibson's personal controversies, shall we say, and
Yes,
there are many of them, um,
yes.
he is a very talented director. He's a very, very good actor.
Mm.
I think people forget the range he had in the 80s. He was doing stuff like Lethal Weapon, and then he catapulted himself into Braveheart, which, like you said, very great film. Very fun film. Extremely
Yes,
inaccurate, but who cares when you're having fun? Um, you know,
exactly.
just It's yeah. I mean, it's the same for most of his films, to be fair, but they're fun and they're interesting, and I think like Scorsese's adaptation, Gibson's adaptation is very personal. Gibson has a knack for dealing with languages he probably can't speak. You know, you look at Apocalypto, fantastic. It tells the exact story that you'd want. It tells something of tribes and it tells something of culture. And Gibson has a knack for that. He has a real knack for it. He has a well, I mean, not Braveheart. He has a knack for getting into cultures and sort of
Scottish is a bit too far out of his, his
yeah.
range, I
Well, it
think.
shouldn't be. He played the bloody Braveheart himself. But I think the I think it's a very interesting film. I think I'm more interested in it than I am in watching it. I'm interested in discussing it more than I am in actually watching it because I watched it for the first time a couple of days ago, and
Okay.
oh my god, I've just seen the box office 612 million for this. This was a
Yeah.
phenomenon because
Yeah.
I was 4 when this film came out. That's how young I am. Tender-old age of 22 over here. Oh my god, I'm 22. But yeah, it's I think especially I feel like this is the boom of Christian-led movies. You look at the stuff that's came out the past few years, like God's Not Dead and Left Behind. That is a stark contrast to essentially a high-budget, very passionate rendition of Jesus' life. And I think the Passion of the Christ, for all its passion, genuinely, is not the greatest film. I think it's more because just some of the reasonings that Gibson gives for especially, you know, showcasing the devil and the temptation, it doesn't quite work. I see what he's going for, it just doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
You know, like the maggot in the nose and like it freaks me out. It's just a bit strange. It's
The
like
baby.
what do 2004 audiences replicate? The devil, maggots, that'll do. It's like he's watched one too many episodes of The Simpsons and thought that's what people want. And it's like, fair enough, you do you. I do think it's a film that looks great. It's a stunning film. It's a lot of blood. The, a lot of blood, which is I think surprising. I think less is more in a case like this. I think it's why Last Temptation of Christ with Scorsese is so touching. With this, it's just like, good God, he's been coated in a pig's carcass. What's happened to him? It's like it feels like less is more, and with Gibson, it's very full on, in your face. He's really hammering the point home, which is fine. I think it's understandable that he wants to do that because he wants to make sure no stone goes unturned, that everything he wants to talk of is in there, which I understand completely. I really respect that. I just don't think it's the greatest adaptation of either Nikos's book or the actual Life of Christ. What do you think of Jim Caviezel though? Because I think that's what people remember this for, isn't it?
I'm not the biggest fan of him in general as a performer. Like, I keep forgetting he's in movies. I was like, oh yes, he's the villain in Deja Vu. Oh yes, he's kind of the lead character, not really in Thin Red Line. It's like no one really remembers him, but I would say probably this is his best performance. But
Yeah,
it is again like one of those roles that's very much like covered in makeup, which some see as a cheat. I think he does a
didn't
great job here. Yeah.
he does? Yeah, didn't he get struck by lightning? Making
Yes,
this, yeah,
there's some like the man got seriously hurt making this movie. And there's like most of those stories behind the scenes are talked about like it's almost like it's a sign from the heavens that they shouldn't make the movie. Don't mess up with Jesus. That's how they talked about it back in the day. I remembered actually this trivia of the lightning, but it's actually more of just like they were shooting and then rain came and it was on this giant piece of wood and there's metal all around it and it was like, oh shit, I'm going to get struck by lightning. And then after like a minute, boom, it came. Things started to burn up and they just saved him in time. But it got hurt.
man.
There is an impressive amount of VFX in this film. I thought there was a lot of
Yeah,
practical work done, but actually there's a lot of VFX. All of the whipping digital. They actually did the reverse that most other filmmakers would have done, where they actually had the wounds there as makeup, and they would digitally add fake skin so that they could have more convincing wounds when they just remove the CGI and just show the. It's fascinating. So there's a lot of work that went into it, and a lot of deliberate odd choices that pay off. Another one that I didn't realize, there's a lot of slow motion in the film, and actually they did that on purpose. Like, they barely anything in this movie is shot at 24 frames a second. A lot of it is shot at, they said, like 28 frames, 35, where they can kind of slow it down a bit, or have it be more kinetic when just playing it regularly. It's just those choices that you're watching it and go, yes, I'm feeling the intensity of the situation, of the places. This was shot in southern Italy, Sassi di Matera. That's the place. Matera is a beautiful city. I've actually been there. Um, but just my thoughts on the film. I like it. I like it with reservations. This is my second time watching it. I watched it the first time in like 2007, something like that. I was 10 years old. Um, what a time to be alive! But that's because it was very much like, I remember, just in general, just Christian households accepted this film as kind of a must watch. I remember this vivid image, one of very few right now, of my great grandfather a couple years before he died, just going there for Easter, and he was sitting in his studio watching a DVD of Passion of the Christ in religious silence, kind of like, just don't go bother him, he's finishing the movie, Passion of the Christ, and that image just always struck with me, and it's and that's how, and that's the interesting comparison between this and Last Temptation. Last Temptation is very, it's a very emotional type of suffering, the psychological suffering that Jesus went through. In this one, it's purely physical. In the other
Yes.
one,
Yeah.
you have just the doubt of whether Jesus is the Messiah. In this one, it's the acceptance of it. It's just, he is the Messiah and this has to happen. And it is very gratuitous. Like, there's no two ways about it. It lingers on the violence in very uncomfortable way by design. So fair enough, I guess.
Do you think
Um,
it works that way? Do you think that works?
at times, yes.
Yeah.
There's I think the flogging scene is a bit much, because again, like, bear in mind, in the scriptures, it's not as this detailed. It's not
Yeah.
a 120 pages script of just like all of the details of how many times he got beaten up and just flogged, and this like the leather clinging to the skin, and the Roman twists the arm, and just blood's flying everywhere. Like, it's disgusting. Like, even knowing what's going to happen, it's still very hard to watch.
Yeah.
And I think the intention behind it is to remind people what happened. It's like, well, Jesus, again, not too dissimilar from Last Temptation in that sense. Oh, you think you knew Jesus, and you like go to church and you hear all of this thing. Like, if you're actually watching it, it was horrifying. And undoubtedly, like, the passion was horrifying. I'm not doubting that. But it does become very sadistic.
Yeah.
And I think we had to get into the controversy of this film, because this film, and just Mel Gibson in general, has been accused of being anti-Semite.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
How do I feel about anti-Semitism? I think it's wrong.
Ewan, give me your thoughts on being a Semite
For
or an
blimey.
anti-Semite.
No, I think that's the thing. Was the controversy about him being an anti-Semite, because there were stories about it, and I'm not sure if they were before or after the Passion of the Christ came out.
Kind
Was
of
there
concurrent when it
concurrently?
started to be made. That's when they
Right.
started pre-production. It was announced, and things starting to come out.
I do think that's the thing. I have no doubts that, I don't know the details of him being an anti-Semite, but obviously anti-Semitism, very wrong. And it does feel a bit happenstance that at the same time as him being accused of anti-Semitism, he's making a film about Jesus and the persecution he went through. I do think that's just happenstance. I really do. I'm not excusing Gibson for it, because it's a fucking horrible thing that he did. But I think to really engage with the story of Christ, Jesus was persecuted by the Jews. That's okay. That's part of it, and I suppose to adapt that, obviously you got to be careful with how you adapt it.
Yes.
Without a doubt, I think the Passion of the Christ, because of how excessive it is with the violence, because of how extreme it is, which was Gibson's intention. I'm pretty sure he did an interview where it's like, I want this to be shocking and extreme and violent. And it's like, all right, but you got to know how to do it still with some subtlety, because if you're having to waft away allegations of anti-Semitism, which I have no idea what the ins and outs of that were, but if you're dealing with that alongside, you get a bad image, and that's completely justified, where it's like people are starting to think, hang on a second, are you really the right man to be directing this? And I kind of get it. I do get it. A lot of it for me comes down to the amount of violence in this, and the implication that was surrounding the film at the time, with not just with the anti-Semitism, but I think there was something like obviously the violence was criticized, but there was like a papal endorsement and stuff like that just surrounding this film. There was a lot of talk, and I think it's one of those films, again, like I said before we start discussing it, it's a film that has so much to talk about beyond what happens on the screen. And what happens on the screen is essentially kind of a misreading. Obviously, it's very personal to Gibson, but I think the implication is that the audience feel penance for Christ's suffering rather than being displayed. You're seeing a man get flogged and beaten and crucified, and it's all horrible and it's bloody and gory, and it's really hard to watch. But it never feels like a penance for the character. It feels more like the audience being put through this. They are on trial here rather than the character that, is very much the title of the film.
Yeah.
Which I think, to be honest, I don't dislike. I think it's an interesting angle to take. I just think it could be done a lot more effectively. I think it could definitely do with some more subtlety. Especially when the director is, for legal reasons, I can't just call him it, but where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah, it's a different way of approaching the story. We can say that.
Yeah, we can say that much. Yes, it was very different.
But I've done some reading because I finished watching the movie a few hours ago. I was like, I want to read up on this, like articles from today, articles from back in the day.
I'm glad someone did, because I didn't.
Because I was curious, because I remember, like, I've seen the South Park episode that makes fun of Passion of the Christ. There's like season 8. It's a very good episode, by the way. I recommend everyone watches it. It's just 20 minutes long. Mel Gibson is portrayed as an absolute sadistic clown. It's so fun. But I wanted to know, like, what does the Jewish community feel about this movie, and why do they consider it to be anti-Semitic and anti-Semitic? And reading up on this, I get it. I get it. I get why they think that. I personally wouldn't consider it to be that, as in it was intentionally made to be anti-Semitic. But I'm reading up on it, and I'm like, well, yeah, it's easy to take away the wrong things from this film. In a way, it's not too dissimilar from when the Joker came out, where everyone was very afraid of what people were going to do. The only thing is that Joker had no real agenda, no real balls in that sense of just kind of like criticizing something outside of like, the system, the society has problems, and there's no healthcare. It's a bit like, okay, but fine, we know those things. It's not shaking anything. But you're watching the Passion of the Christ. It is very physical. It is very brutal. It is accurate to a point, because I said the same thing. I was like, well, that's how it was in the Bible. You have Caiaphas and the other high priests of Jerusalem who go, Jesus has to die because it's blasphemous. Like, yes, they are in the movie, but I'm watching it. I was like, geez, but Caiaphas here is just hamming it up. He's like he's a Jewish caricature, just kind of like screaming, oh.
That's the thing, yeah. You've got to be so careful adapting something this big, because this is something that billions of people believe, and to do something like that, not good.
No,
really not good.
Especially,
you know what? Now that you've said that, it does seem like it was a bit intentional.
Not only that, but after watching The Last Temptation of Christ, in there you have Pontius Pilate, David Bowie, who's very not good. Like he's not a tragic figure or anything. It's kind of like, I don't give two shits about you. And he's like, you know what? I don't care, to the point that I'm just going to wash my hands clean of everything that you're doing. And then he's going to pay up for it in the dream version, let's say, in the alternate reality of this. No, sorry, but whatever. But in here, the Romans, outside of the like free sadistic Romans that keep beating Jesus up throughout the journey to Calvary, you have Pontius Pilate, you have his wife, played by Claudia Gerini. Like he is almost feeling remorse for what he's doing. He doesn't want to do it. He's a very like, I don't want to kill. Just beat him up a little bit, but I don't want to kill him. He shouldn't die, in my opinion. They make him very sympathetic, and he keeps cutting back to the Caiaphas and the others, and they're like, no, kill him, kill him. And I was watching, I was like, oh yes, this is kind of reminding you that in the movie's version, of course, that's what I'm saying. It's kind of like, oh yeah, it is fault of the Jews. They killed Jesus. They're the one who killed Jesus. It's right. And it's very dangerous. And I don't
Yeah.
think it was intentionally done. But I'm watching it like I get it now, reading up on various articles and how they believe that it was very well. Not only this, but just historically, the Passion was actually like in the year 100 after Christ, or 200, whatever. Like no one was reenacting the Passion. There weren't the 12 stations of the cross. We just remember those things. They weren't happening. They started around the Middle Ages, because they wanted people to hate the Jews, and the Passion was reenacted to have like stupid as peasants go, they killed Jesus. It's your fault that he isn't alive. I guess, I don't know what's the point. Like he has to die. That's the beauty of The Last Temptation. He has like that's his arc. That's his character arc. He has to die in order to be reborn and bring peace and joy and love and all the beautiful stuff. Whatever. But in this one, yes, I was like, I'm liking the movie,
Yeah.
but now I get it. Not in a bad way. Now I get it.
Do you think a lot of it comes down to, because it's not the most accurate adaptation, and a lot of the changes seem to be very specific to characters whose faith is Jewish, and
Yes.
it's I know I said it was a coincidence and happenstance earlier, but the more you think about it, like
It's starting to click a little bit.
Sanhedrin, for instance, it really mounts to something that is more than just a coincidence. That is something. I mean, put it this way: there are changes that Gibson makes here that are clearly not in the gospel, and most of those changes are to do with characters that are Jewish, and most of those characters are not presented in the best of lights, and that the amount of time, if it happens once or twice and it's actually in the gospel, fair play. If it's an adaptation of Nicholas's book, all right, shaky ground, but fair enough, Gibbo. The fact that it's so constant, and I feel like I'm doing a whip round here, but I've just been listening to what you've said, and you've actually done reading on it, and I've just been catching up with a couple of articles as well, like the Jesus Geza Vermes wrote an article on the film when it came out, and he said it was historically wrong, horribly gory, and it will inspire Judophobia. And it's hard to see him being incorrect on that, because there is a lot in this film that is highly fictional. It's far away from what the gospel actually says. It's further away than what fucking Nicholas, is it named Nicholas? Nikos. I don't know why I'm saying Nicholas. What Nikos wrote, it's far away, and it does seem like Gibson's projecting a lot of feelings onto this film.
Yeah,
not good feelings.
No. For me, honestly, like you can remove the devil, the androgynous devil. I'm fine with it. It's like,
that was an odd one, yeah.
Doesn't add anything. Doesn't change anything. Even though I do like the weirdly, like the image of Satan holding a baby that's deformed and just licking him, and I love it. This small thing, like in the behind the scenes. You have Mel Gibson like kind of like shoving that, like talking to the actors about it's like, oh, and you can like hold him and you just go like this, you lick his hand, and she's like, you're crazy. Just shaking her head. You're crazy. It's like, yes, very much so.
Oh,
um,
good grief.
it's a stroke of madness that I can kind of appreciate, but it does take away a bit from the more grounded approach of the narrative, I would say.
Yeah.
But you know what? I'm kind of putting myself into disliking this movie now that we're talking about it, especially after having talked about The Last Temptation of Christ, because we came to the conclusion the beauty of that film and that book is that ultimately it is cliched, but it's all about love. It's all about
Yes.
forgiveness. That's what Jesus was preaching for, and that's the message that comes through. In this film, uh, Judas betrays Jesus, and it's not kind of like, oh, change of heart, I'm gonna kill myself or whatever. No, it's he gets like like assaulted by kids that are very demonic. So it's like, are they a vision of just his a portrayal and manifestation of his guilt, or are they actually just assaulting? I don't know, but it's torture. It's that it ultimately leads him to killing himself. It's like, okay, you also have the same thing with with the bandit on the cross, because you have Jesus who gets crucified together with two other people, one on to the right, one to the left, and the one to the right is very like in the movie of the other movie, and just like in the gospel, is crying, "Oh God, I apologize for everything that I did. I don't want to be here." And the other's like, "Ah, don't cry, you stupid idiot. Just who cares about Jesus? We're just gonna die." Ugh. And Jesus says, "Oh, you who believed in me and in heaven, just you're going to die peacefully, and that's fine, and I forgive you for being an asshole." That's kind of how it is. But in Mel Gibson, is kind of like, but let's also add a crow. Like Reigns comes down and just starts gouging this man's eyes out for being an absolute dick. Okay, that's Mel. I get what you're going for. This doesn't sound like forgiveness to me. This sounds like you're actually like hating everyone in this. Even Caiaphas, like the temple gets destroyed in this very, like the set of the temple gets destroyed, and the man even burns his hand on a fire. It's kind of like, yeah, there's very little forgiveness going on here. You know, it's like, yeah, very conflicted thoughts now that I'm
Yeah.
talking about it.
I think, especially considering, the general story of Jesus. From this is really shaky. I'm going off of stuff I learned in primary school and secondary school, which is that was a long time ago. But I mean, the general story of Jesus is a story of forgiveness. It's a story of love, and it feels like Gibson not just extracts that out of this story, but he makes active attempts to keep it out. He's actively trying to keep this as horribly brutal as he can, because obviously, you know, in every adaptation you're going to have to show the suffering of Christ, but to make that the centerpiece kind of misses the prime point of it. It misses the actual objective of Jesus
Yeah,
actually dying for forgiveness, for love, and actually forgiving those that did it to him. And
dying for our sins.
Exactly, and Gibson's take on it is, Jesus Chainsaw Massacre, which is,
Yeah, which I again like I applaud him for just the way the movie's put together. Everything's
yeah,
like
yeah,
technically it's beautifully made, um, and even the idea I can kind of applaud in a way, because it's because we've seen this story like a gajillion times. The only other really different version is the Scorsese film, which adapted the novel by Kazantzakis. This one is trying to be more focused on just the passion, which again, fair enough, but yeah, um, it's it uh that's what they say in the South Park episode, which I kind of agree with. It's almost like guilting people into feeling sorry for Jesus and trying to be better people because you've seen the physical suffering of him, but there's no real message. What's the message
yeah,
here? Because again, you don't feel the love, you don't feel the compassion. There's a couple, I will say there's a couple great moments in this. I think when Mary rushes to help Jesus and on the cross, and it cuts back and forth to her when she was younger and helping little Jesus out. That's a very tender moment, and the music swells and it's very emotional. I think that works. I don't remember the cross bearer that helps Jesus. Is in the Bible as well. I don't remember his name, but like when he gets very upset about what's happening, that's another great moment in this. That's very emotional. I think those scenes stand out. Monica Bellucci plays Mary Magdalene. I think she's very great in this film. She doesn't say much, but she's holds a great presence on the screen. But it's but yeah, like I think this is the last question. Like, what's the message? Is there a message, Ewan? I don't think so.
I don't want to think what Gibson's message is here. Like,
Kill
no,
the Jews.
well, yeah, pretty
Oh
much.
no.
I
Oh no.
I wonder if that'll make it into the episode.
Censored. It's Mel Gibson speaking. We don't condone
Are you? Yeah.
anti-Semitism.
No, God, no. That's the thing. I think I say every. We've looked at three. The two, the novel and the Scorsese adaptation feel deeply personal, and they're moving. Gibson's doesn't feel personal.
Mhm.
However, at the same time, kind of is, but in a different way. It doesn't tackle his brushes with faith. It doesn't tackle his doubts or his worries. It's very much a film that tries its best to stay neutral, and you can't stay neutral in something that means a lot to so many. You can't feel neutral on a religious belief. You can't feel neutral on love or forgiveness.
Mhm.
And what Gibson's trying to persuade us of here is that the suffering is enough to convince an audience to watch. And that may be the case. That might be true. But it's not enough for me. It's not enough to just say, yeah, that fella's getting right fucked up for an hour and a bit. That's not enough. You gotta understand why. You've got to understand the implications of it and what it's doing it for. You've got to understand what's going on around it. And I think that's why I like the latter half of Scorsese's piece, where Jesus actually comes down from the cross and he lives out his life. It's, obviously it's not too accurate to the old original telling, but it adds that layer. It adds a personification that is personal to the director, and I think that's the most important thing, because while it is controversial for people on the religious right, it isn't controversial for people who can understand that this is a retelling that someone is trying to just get to grips with themselves over, and to publicize that does help.
Yep.
To actually create something in the midst of doubt or religious choice or change is very commendable. And I think Scorsese does it best, and I think Nikos does it as well, very, very well. And I don't think Gibson has the intention of changing his perception or changing his thoughts. He's very committed to what he believes in. I think that's the difference. Scorsese has his own doubts, and he's telling them as he goes. Whereas
Yes.
Gibson is just showing what he believes to have happened, which, as it turns out, is not very accurate at all, to
Yeah.
say the least. But I think that's the big disparity between them.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. Honestly, I like the film more like you said. It's more fun to talk about it and to just look at rather than just enjoying it per se.
Yeah.
And I think, like, I love Mel Gibson as a filmmaker. I wish he made more movies. I know he's been working on he came dangerously close to making a pure flicks movie with the first part of Hacksaw Ridge. Like,
Yeah.
oh boy, I'm mama's boy. I love Jesus. I don't want to fight the war.
If you want your fix of Mel Gibson content, he's doing loads of action films now. He's
entered
Panama.
the
He's done Last Looks, Agent Game, Boss Level, Force of Nature. Fat Man was actually all right. I'll give him that one.
I literally only watched Fat Man and Boss Level of his latest movies. No, and I was at the premiere of freaking Dragged Across Concrete. I love as Craig Tyler, very very complex individual. I know it's not a lot of people like him. There's a lot to talk about that, but we'll leave that for maybe Uncut Gems if we ever do a few episodes on him.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's fallen. I don't know. Like, he's supposed to be doing a lot of things. I would love to watch his Wild Bunch remake because I think he would pull it off brilliantly. Even though I'm usually against remakes, but that can work. But he's making. It is happening. I think it is actually happening now. The resurrection of the Christ. I don't know. Like, the sequel to this movie is
yeah.
It has been
I have
teased for so long. But it's October 21st of October 2021 on IMDb Pro. It says pre-production has started. So maybe it is actually happening. Maybe in 1 year's time we'll be here talking about the resurrection of the Christ or whatever.
I would just like just before we finish with the Mel Gibson talk, I would like to go on the record and say What Women Want is actually an alright film.
It is cute. It is cute.
Demented. It's so beyond the pale of the premise is Mel Gibson has to electrocute himself over and over to be in touch with people around him, and even then, he's just invading the privacy of their own mind. It's fascinating. It's so strange, but yeah, I do wish Gibson had kind of made more films and less controversial personal choices, shall we say. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Yeah. Very good director, though. I think, again, it's like, you just to reiterate what you said, that the technical aspects of Passion of the Christ, very intense and very rewarding to watch.
Yep.
It's just a shame that the actual content itself is not damnable, but certainly not as passionate, not as real, not as justifiable as any other adaptation, really.
I think that's the best way that we can end it. You said it better than I could, honestly. And yeah, I think last question, just about, because Passion of the Christ, whatever. Last Temptation of Christ. Which version do you prefer, movie or book?
I think the book. That's just spitballing. That's like, haven't thought about it, jumped into it. The book. I think the book. I think for me, it's reading those scenes, being able to actually pause and
savor
think on
them
it and just savor it. Yeah, exactly that. To actually take a moment to think, well, what does that really mean? What's the implication there? What's the message here? And you can do that with Scorsese's film, don't get me wrong. I just think there's something a bit more personal about Nikos's adaptation. But then again, Scorsese's is personal as well. I think it solely comes down to preference on the sense of which story do you want to hear. Do you want to hear the story of a man that's bounced back and is directing his faith, or do you want to hear the story of a man that has always battled his faith? And I think there are portions of the Last Temptation of Christ, the book, where it is genuinely perfect, where the prose really comes to life, and I think a lot of that is to do with how strong a writer Nikos was, and how
very imaginative as well.
Very, very imaginative, and it all comes from a place of a man trying to understand his faith. And I think it's more touching for me to see someone struggle with adapting their own faith than with Scorsese, who was using it to justify his own beliefs. I think there's a slight difference there, but they're both very, very strong.
Yeah, I think this is a rare case where I have to agree that the book is superior to the film, because generally we've ended up thinking that most of the times some of the movies are better than the books, but in this case, it's just the depth. Just very simple. You can get it's almost 700 pages long, and you get to know these characters. And I think for me, what made me tip in favor of the book is the character of Mary Magdalene, because in the movie, she just kind of disappears after the first part. Like, there's a big conversation with Jesus, she kisses his feet, and then that's it. It's like, what? She's a bit silent, and I love Barbara Hershey. I think she's great in the film, but it's not the book. Like, in the book, all of those moments are just so beautiful, and just the ending and all of that, like you said, especially because Kazantzakis can get away with a lot more in terms of visuals, and just kind of like, he gets swept up and whatever. Like, you couldn't pull it off in 1988. And I commend Scorsese for not even trying. He went his own route. Bless him. Bless him, bless him, bless him. But yeah. This is it. This is the end of this Easter special.
Yeah, we've managed to get through a whole Easter-themed special without mentioning chocolate eggs, which I think we got so close until I brought it up there.
And no bunnies.
Very proud
no
of
bunnies.
No
no
bunnies.
But yes, no. Well, yeah. Let's save the chocolate eggs for the actual celebration. Thank you to everyone for listening to this Easter special. If you are a believer, happy Easter. If you're not, enjoy a bit of a break for just a couple of days, because we can all use them. We really could.
Yeah.
So yeah, Ewan, why don't you tell us where the listeners can find you?
You know what? I've actually made a list that I
Hey.
can just prattle off.
Man.
You can find me on Letterboxd and Twitter at Ewan Gleadow, EWANGLEADOW. It'll be the one with the verified tick next to it, because I am a certified journalist. It'll be the one where it looks like my header is Hunter S. Thompson. He's pointing a revolver at me. That'll be me. I didn't plan that. He's actually pointing at a typewriter, but it's been cut off by my profile picture. So don't worry about that. Give us a follow. And you can find my work and my writing and all my little bits and pieces at Cult Following, The Geek Show, Narc Magazine, Clapper, Horrorwood, Any Volume, Spotlight, Newcastle World, Spark Sunderland, Daily Star, and Death by Adaptation podcast.
Yay!
Hey, we got there eventually. It's only taken me, 13 episodes to figure that out. Brilliant.
There we go. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at NickeyBrand97. There you can find links to everything. My Linktree / Enjoy the Movies that has my links to YouTube, Vimeo, Clapper articles, all the good stuff. You can also follow us, and you can reach out to us if you have questions, comments, ideas, thoughts, whatever. You can just write to us on Twitter and Instagram, Death Adaptation and Death by Adaptation respectively, or on YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, just comment down below, smash that like button, ring the bell. I don't know how YouTube works nowadays. It's been a while since I've actively been on there. And stay tuned, because in 2 weeks' time, after this little holiday break, we'll come back with another spiritual tale. We are talking about Clockwork Orange, Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece and Anthony Burgess' book. So stay tuned for that one. We hope to see you soon. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you have a lovely Easter. Bye-bye.
Bye. That sounded terrible. Goodbye.